Welcome to our study on the book of Romans. We're studying Sanctification, and we had a break since our last, it seems forever since we've been here, doesn't it? We had a break, and so because of that break, I want to remind you where we left off. We left off working our way toward the end of Romans 7, and what I promised you was we would finish up 7 and get into Romans 8 today in these two sessions. And we are indeed going to do that. I know that's hard for you to believe considering how many verses are staring us in the face here in Romans chapter 7. But we've got through verse 20. So what I'd like to do is, just to make sure that we are on the same page, and just to make sure that we're all understanding what it is that we're looking at, I want to take you very quickly. Now, if you have a question, I'll give you an opportunity to ask it, but I think everybody's going to mentally follow where we're going. In the last sessions we had together, we covered Romans 7:14 through 20. If you recall, here is 7:14. For we know that the law is spiritual, but I am carnal, sold under sin. The only thing I need you to remember about that is when it says the law is spiritual, it's not repeating what it said back 2 verses in verse 12, that the law is just and good. When it said it was spiritual, there are 3 things about anything that is spiritual. Do you remember what they are? Anybody remember in their head? Here they are. First of all, it gets in your mind. And that's not, I'm not just using terminology here. This is important. It gets into your mind. That's your inner man. It seeks to motivate you. In this case, when it says the law is spiritual, it means the law wants you to use it to restrain sin and promote good. Even though you know that doesn't work, the natural thing the law does, because it is spiritual, is it wants to do that. And the third thing is it seeks to change you. In this case, it seeks to give you functional life. But you know you can't utilize the law to have functional life. But this is what the law naturally attempts to do. But there's a problem with that, and we saw that in the verse, but I am carnal, sold under sin. The but is the breakdown. The law is spiritual, but, now we're going in a different direction. When it says I am carnal, we found a definition for carnal. Anybody remember off the top of your head what that was? Weakness. Weakness. I'm weak. I don't have the power to do that. And the law is dependent. In fact, we're so weak, that description is so weak that it says that we are sold under sin. When something is sold, it becomes the possession of someone else, and it comes under their control, and that's what happens. Then we have sin dwelling in our members. We already know about that. And we already know that just because we were justified unto eternal life, back in those first 5 chapters, we learned about that, we were not made sinless, were we? And secondly, we know that sin was never eradicated for us. It was never done away with. We still have sin in our members in this body of flesh. And the outstanding thing about the flesh is it's weak. And the law tries to get in our mind. Well, it does. It gets in our mind and it says, use me, this perfect, righteous, good, and just law, to live for God. Do that. But the thing is, the flesh is so weak, it can't supply the power. The law has no power to do that on its own. It is powerless. So it's depending on the energy of our flesh, and the flesh is weak. And that's the problem. Even though the law is spiritual, the problem's not with the law, the problem is with us. It relies on the flesh for its power, the power is weak. That's why every time I try to utilize, now I know I'm not going to spend long on this, but listen, it is critical for you to get it now, because once we leave this issue, and we're leaving it in this session, once we leave this issue, that is supposed to be firmly entrenched in your mind, in your inner man. And that is the reality for you from this point forward. And the Scripture, if we move forward in it, is going to act like that's true for us, that it is in us. So if you do nothing more than encapsulate it in a phrase to say, You know what? I may not be able to call up just from memory all the things the Scriptures told me about it, but for 2 chapters now, Paul's been beating this horse about the law can't get the job of our sanctification done. And that's the one thing you need to really have working in your mind. And every time I try to utilize the law to control sin, then the law is going to give sin more power. Remember, exceeding power. And it's going to outdo any of my attempts in the energy of my flesh to try to do this. Now, I want to take the next verses, 15 to 20, and lump them all together in this little quick review, and that'll end the review. Because in these verses, Paul is giving us his personal testimony that in sample of, I tried to use the law to live unto God, and here's what it got me, failure. And that's what he's going to do. So let me just take you through these verses. For that which I do, I allow not. For what I would, that do I not. But what I hate, that I do. If then I do that which I would not, I consent unto the law that it is good. Then it is no more I that do it, but sin that dwelleth in me. For I know that in me, that is, in my flesh, dwelleth no good thing. For the will is present with me, but how to perform that which is good, I find not. For the good that I would, I do not. But the evil which I would not, that I do. Now if I do that I would not, it is no more I that do it, but sin that dwelleth in me. I talked to you about people, and the way I was taught in college is, that's describing the old nature and the new nature fighting it out in my inner man. That is not what that was about. The context is not about that at all. It is not a comparison of unsaved Paul with saved Paul. That's another take on that. That's not what that was. Paul, as a justified unto eternal life, called to be an apostle, attempting to utilize the law to produce sanctification. This is his testimony of what happens when he does that. All he's doing is saying what I just told you in the previous verses, that when you try to use the law to live unto God, sin is going to have more power than your flesh. And now he's coming along and saying, I can bear personal testimony that happens every single time. And by the way, that's the way it's supposed to happen. It's exactly what the law was geared to do. So, the law gave sin power that the flesh could not deal with. And he utterly failed to produce functional life. Now, when he says in verse 20, now if I do that I would not, it is no more I that do it, but sin that dwelleth in me. This is the last verse we were on last time. And I just want to make sure we're clear on this verse. This is not Paul giving himself an alibi for when he does wrong. See, when he says, it is no more I that do it, but sin that dwelleth in me. Paul's not saying, oh, well, when I do something bad, it's not me anymore. It's just sin. He's not excusing himself. That's not what's going on. And he's not trying to jump out of the blame. It is a statement that Paul is making in the context of everything else we've just read that says, even though Paul wasn't intending to do these wrong things, sin, that's what he wound up doing. Because sin was greater than his power of flesh. See, when he says, now, if I do that I would not, if I do the things I don't want to do, it's not that I wanted to do it. It's no more I that do it. I didn't want to do that. I wanted to do the right thing. I wanted to do righteousness. He says, but sin that dwelleth in me. That's the overcoming power of sin. And the law gives sin that overcoming power. And I just want to be clear about verse 20 because I felt like we're a little bit, maybe we didn't cover that quite as clearly as we needed to the last time. And so that sin that's dwelling in him has a greater strength of will than Paul has. It has greater power than any power that Paul has. And no matter how hard Paul tried, the power of sin was greater. And the reason he's saying this to you is because if it's true for him, it's true for us. And that was the job of the law, to show us that sin exceeds our strength to produce functional life. Sin's will is stronger, and it's going to win in the end every time. And you can do nothing about that spiritual deadness on your own. You need something else. That was the law, the job of the law. Okay, now that ends our review. Any question about those verses 14 to 20? Okay. Verse 21. I find, this is great. This is great. You need to really hold on to your hat with this. Are you ready? I find then a law that when I would do good, evil is present with me. For I delight in the law of God after the inward man. But I see another law in my members, warring against the law of my mind, and bringing me into captivity to the law of sin, which is in my members. Now, when he says, I find then, what do you automatically know about what you're about to hear? That it's based on something that, when he says, I find then, yeah, it's what he just got through discussing with you. He's about now to give you some further detail about this, about when he tried to put himself under the law of Moses to produce functional life. So he says, I find then, and what is it Paul found? Well, here it is. I find then a law. Do not fall into the trap of seeing a word and defining it only one way every time you read it. How many times have we seen this? Lots, right? This is another example of that. Now, this is a place where people really get tripped up, because I'm going to tell you that they think that when Paul says, I find then a law, they say, see, Paul says we're under the law. He's just spent 2 chapters telling you you're not under the law but under grace. And now they're going to take this one phrase, and negate 2 chapters worth of teaching. You do see, please tell me you see how ridiculous that is. Okay. Paul is not referring to the law of Moses. He says, I find then a law. Does that mean he just discovered the law of Moses? Are you kidding? Of course not. When he says that, he is saying, I found something to be true. When I tried it, every time I did it, I found that it was true, and because I found it to be true, he says I can call it a law. Now, we do the same kinds of things. There is a law, I'm going to demonstrate it for you, called gravity. Watch this. I'm going to let go of this marker. Can anybody predict what's going to happen to the marker when I let it go? See, you're all smiling like he's a moron. That's what happens when he takes a week off. Okay, look. The law of gravity takes over. If I drop this 100 times, how many times will the marker fall? And you know what we call that? That's a law. We find this is just the way it works every time. Every time you ever threw a rock into the air, did you ever throw it and you went, wow, gravity didn't take over that, it just kept going. Wow, it's probably out at Mars by now. You know the old saying, if it goes up, it comes down. Because gravity is a law. When Newton was sitting under, I don't know if it was an apple tree, I can't even remember how all that worked, but when the apple falls on his head, he could have said the same thing that Paul said here. I find then a law that if something's not holding it up, when it's left on its own, it always comes down. It's the law of gravity. Now we have another law, the law of aerodynamics. I'm choosing that one specifically. The law of aerodynamics. And a plane utilizes that law. That when those wings are stretched out, when you get enough air passing over and under those wings, and they're at the right angle, you can lift a lot of weight up off the ground. A lot of weight. And that's the law of aerodynamics. And we find that It works every time. When I was flying out here from North Texas every week, I never got on the plane. You know, they always do that thing. Please pay attention to the stewardess who's going to give you the safety briefing, you know. And then she talks about, in the event of emergency, an oxygen mask will fall down out of the cabin. You know, pull the cord, put it over your nose, and you know, and they do that. I used to know that thing by heart. I used to just be reading that American Way magazine going, and pull it tightly over your head, pull each side. If you have a child, put your own mask on before you put your child's on. I mean, I just would blah, blah, blah. They never, ever said, if the law of aerodynamics work, we should be there in about 54 minutes. They never said, if that law works. Do you know why? It always works. Now, I'm just taking the time to say this because that's the way Paul is using the word law here. I find then, like I said, then, in view of my personal testimony of trying to utilize the law to live for God and it always failed, I find then a law. And here it is. When I would do good, evil is present with me. And that's in the context of utilizing the law to produce functional life. He said, so here's the law. The law, you could call it the law of the law. Couldn't you? I'm not trying to confuse you, but it is going to get a little bit confusing here in just a moment. So I'm trying to sort all this out. So here's what we have. We have the law of Moses. That is what we normally refer, that's the law, right? Okay? You're not under the law, but under grace. You're not under the law of Moses, you're under grace. Now we have a law. Now this is number one, this is number two. Paul says, now I found a law that when I try, and this law says that when I try to utilize the law to do good, all of a sudden evil is present with me. The things that I would, I do not. The things I would not, those things I do. You know. Okay. Now, you know, I'm surprised that we're here already. I was really thinking that this came a little later. Okay. All right. So, here's what else. Here's what Paul is saying. When I would do good, does that mean Paul wants to do good? So he's applied his will to say, I want to do good. I want to do that. And not only that, but I'm going to give an effort. Would you agree that that's included in that? And that there's going to be, there's some kind of desire to utilize the commandment to try to produce righteousness, to try to produce functional life. And he says, and every time I would do that, every time I really try and I utilize that commandment, boom, evil is present with me. Now, evil is that term about sin that refers to it in its exceedingness. We've already seen that being told us just in the previous verses there. It indicates that, and you tell me, according to what Paul is saying to us, the harder he tries, what's the result? All of those answers are right, and the people on the video right now are going like, I didn't hear any of them. So I'm going to just say, the harder he tries, the worse it gets, right? The harder he tries, the more sin exceeds his ability to try. The more he tries, the worse it gets. Did someone else say anything else? That was about it? Well, and here's what he's saying. I'm calling that a law. Because it happens every time. It's not that it mostly happens. It always happens. And by the way, there's a difference between a law and a rule. If it's a rule, do you know what that means? It's generally true. So we even use that in our terminology, don't we? We would say, well, as a rule, which means generally or most of the time, here's how it happens. But, so, you know what? So, you know, when my kids were growing up, some things were rules, other things were laws. If it was a rule, you may or may not get an exception to the rule. That terminology, see? But when it was a law, that was that. That just worked. Okay. Now, when now, with that, I think you've got that in mind. So now let's move to verse 22. I just want you to know that that law that he found is not the law of Moses. Everybody clear on that? And he's not naming it, he's defining it. The defining of that law is, when I try to use the commandment to do good, evil overcomes that. Evil is present with me. It calls it evil, not just sin, because it's the encapsulation of everything that sin can become. No matter what his effort, there's even more opposing him. Now verse 22. For I delight in the law of God after the inward man. Here's another trouble verse. People look at that and say, see, Paul delighted in the law of God. Now in verse 22, let me change this. It is the law of God, Moses, but let's call it the law of God. This is what they call it here, and this is in verse 22. This law is verse 21. Right? I find then a law that when I would do good, evil is present with me. Now in verse 22, for I delight in the law of God after the inward man. Now I want to talk to you about the word. People look at that and say, oh, see, Paul delights in the law. He loves the law. Do you remember the context that he's talking to you about? About utilizing the law to try to produce his functional life. And the word delight here, again, it's that one of those words that commonly, when we see the word delight, we think of a word that means something that brings great pleasure, something that brings real joy and happiness. Hey, I delight. But the outstanding thing about the word delight, and I don't want to take you back to the Latin root on that, all that really doesn't matter because you'll understand this. If it's something that you delight in, would you agree that it is something that is attractive? I mean, in your mind, there's something about it that you look at and you go, I like that. And Paul says, in my inward man, there is this natural delight for the law. That shouldn't shock you. I shouldn't really have to explain this very much because we already saw this back in chapter 6. The infirmity of our flesh. Do you remember what I told you? The flesh loves the law and is drawn to the law automatically. It wants the law. And that's because, see, this is why the review is so important. This is why the review. This is why it was a stroke of genius for me to give you the review today. Since you're not going to say it, I'm just going to have to say it. What is the first thing? The law is spiritual. The first thing it does is what? It gets in your mind. Remember that? And he said, and remember I told you that's your inner man. And it tries to motivate you and change you to produce functional life. That's what it's trying to do. He says, the natural thing for me to do, I delight in the law of God after the inward man. It is in my mind. It is trying to motivate me. It is trying to get me to use it. That's the whole thing about the law. He's not saying, I love to use the law to produce my sanctified life. That's not what he's saying here. And this whole context has been the failure of utilizing the law. And so when he says, I delight after the law, I'm going to lose my place here. I delight in the law of God after the inward man. He's really not, he's really saying, am I through with that verse? He is saying that this law is in my mind. It's attractive to me. It's appealing to me. It arouses my interest. When he says I delight in it, it allures him. It does. It beckons him. It's something that works in his mind to make him think that this is something good. Now, As we said, the law of God is that law that was given to Moses on Mount Sinai. Paul says, I delight in the law of God. So he says there's this natural attraction to the law of God. And why wouldn't there be? The law is holy and just and good. And if you want to do righteousness, why wouldn't you be attracted to that? The only reason you're not is because for how long now I've just beat the law into the dirt. So you may be saying, it doesn't look very attractive to me. Good! That means I'm doing my job. But for the natural person, the law does look it's the very standard of God's righteousness. So delight is describing all the natural attractiveness of the law as it appeals to your mind and it works in your mind. Now we're going to come back to that, but if you have that, and that's what's happening in people about their sanctifications, they think, I'm going to be able to utilize this law that is good and righteous and all this stuff and produce a sanctification. God's going to be pleased with that. But of course, you already know that thing is destined for failure because the law is depending on your flesh to energize it, and you don't have the ability to do that. Sin is going to overpower that every time. And so with that, Paul says, when he says, I delight in the law of God after the inward man, he's talking about that natural desire that people want when they want to change. And that kind of makes sense. Now verse 23. But I see another law in my members. Okay. All right, you can't tell the players without a program. We're going to keep up with the laws here. Are you ready? There's really only 3. But he says, I see another law in my members warring against the law of my mind and bringing me into captivity to the law of sin which is in my members. I know that looks like a whole lot of different laws. And you know, I made myself a chart because I thought, you know what, if I put this up on the board this way, this will be, oh, you know what, I've got a chart. Is it still sitting back there? No. Oh, here it is. I took these verses. I just printed them up real big, and I thought, let me separate the laws on here. So, and really, there's only, in fact, I think I even have a PowerPoint to the effect. The law of God, you know what that is. That's the law given at Mount Sinai. Okay, the commandments and 623 laws. The law of sin in my members. That's the second law. And the third law is the law of my mind. In verse 21, when he said, I find a law, that is the same law as verse 23 says, another law. That's the same law. Another law in my member. And at the end of that verse, let me see if I've got that verse up here. Look, and look at the end of this verse. I see another law in my members, warring against the law of my mind, and bring me into captivity to the law of sin. Which is in my members. All of those are talking about the same thing. He introduced it to you in verse 21. These two, you get in verse 23. He says, I found a law that when I would do good, evil is present with me. And then he says, my inward man delights in that law of God. It really wants to do that. He says, but But means, okay, corner word, going in a different direction. I delight in the law of God. I want to use it. It feels right. But I see another law in my members. That's the shorthand. The long expression is at the end of the verse. It's the law of sin in my members. When he says, my inner man loves the law of God, but there's another law I found that's working in my members, that when I would do good, evil is present with me. It doesn't matter how much I delight in that law, I can't make it work. You see? Okay. So, what do I have left here? Okay, so, you know what? I did give you, verse 23 was the next one. So, here's the first law, law of Moses, verse 22. Now, Romans 7:23, we just read, I went back to get it. I didn't realize I'd put it in there ahead. So, that's what we have. The law of God, that holds out the hopeful prospect of a self-produced functional life. Of course, it won't work. The law of my mind. Here's that third law, which is the unfailing truth that why trying to produce sanctification by means of the law, when I would do good, evil is present with me. You remember when I wrote this up a while ago? The law gets what? When it is spiritual, the very first aspect is it gets in your mind. And that's exactly the terminology that Paul is using here when he says the law, look, I see another law in my members warring against the law of my mind. The law of my mind is I can use the law to get this done. He says, but there's another law that wars against that, and it's the law of sin in my members. In my mind, it all seems to work really good, but when I try to do it, this other law takes over and supersedes it. So I'm going to use the gravity and aerodynamics again. Gravity always works, but there is a law of aerodynamics that will, for as long as it's in effect, overcome the law of gravity, because it's a greater law. But when that law ceases, the law of gravity takes back over. So as long as that plane is obeying the law of aerodynamics, it's going to overpower the law of gravity. Law of gravity hasn't gone away. It's just a lesser power. So Paul says this, and this is, I'm right, that third one up here, the law of my mind. So what's the law of my mind? The law of my mind says I can take the law of God and produce a functional life. It feels right. The law is righteous. The law is good. And in my mind, because what does the law do? Because it's spiritual. It gets in your mind and it motivates you to change. There's those three parts of the law is spiritual. And he says that law gets in my mind. He said that's the law of my mind. The law gets in there and says, hey, because the commandment is God's standard of righteousness, you can do this to please God. He says, but about the time I get ready to put that law into motion, I find then another law. It's the law of sin in my members. And it overpowers that law of my mind that tells me, the law of my mind said, you can use the law of God. But the law of sin in my members shows me every time I do, I fail utterly. But it's worse than that. I want you to look at this. It says, but I see another law in my members, warring. When you see that word warring against the law of my mind, warring, what's in your mind when you see that word? It's a battle. It's a conflict. It's a war. Warring against the law of my mind. And he says, and guess who wins? the law of sin in my members, it brings me into captivity. You have now become a POW of the law of sin in your members. Anytime you think you're going to take the law of your mind, look, you're going to take God's law, which seems really right. It gets in your mind. It makes you think you can use it. And by the way, I guess that's why I can't be too hard on people who think, let me use the law to try to live for God. Because it's what the law does. It is spiritual. It gets in your mind. It motivates you to change and produce functional life. But the problem is, you know what the core of the problem is. It needs energy from something, and the only thing the law can get energy from is the flesh. And we know the flesh is carnal. It's weak. It has no power. But the thing is, so Paul says, so I have this law in my mind that says I can do this, but every time I do, this other law carries out a battle against this law in my mind, and I get carried away captive. I lose this battle. I'm destined to lose this battle. Now, I know that was a lot of different aspects of law and all that kind of bit, but the thing is, I want you to see that Paul is showing you how this works. You can't see the word law as meaning the law of Moses every time it comes up in these verses. And even when you do see the law of God mentioned in verse 22, for I delight in the law of God in the inward man, you know what he's saying? There's a natural tendency in me that wants to use the law of God. And that is the law of my mind. It got in my mind and said, you can do it. But as soon as I did, now here's the real kicker to this. Not only did this other law kick in and overpower the law of my mind that said I could do it, I found out I can't. I got killed in action. My functional life got put to death. You know what the real kicker is? The very thing you thought you were going to utilize to produce functional life is the thing that empowered this other law to kill you. Okay, that didn't mean near as much to you as it did to me, did it? But when you're looking at that, you're saying, wait a minute, I'm going to use the law of God. It's a good thing. It gets in my mind. The law in my mind says I can do it. And when your back is turned, the very good thing you think you're going to use gives its power to a different law and produces death. Remember what Paul said in the last, a couple of sessions back? But the commandment came and sin revived and I died. See how he's doing this? Why is he going to such lengths? Why does God inspire Paul to go to these lengths? Because this thing has got to be firmly, forever settled in your mind that there is no way you can ever utilize the law to produce functional life. He is showing you that because it's a law, you're going to fail every single time. And he doesn't want you to see it as a failure while I tried my best. He wants you to see it as you are a casualty of war. It is taking you captive. And if you're taken captive, now listen, here's the important thing. If you are taken captive in this battle, then Satan's policy of evil for us in the dispensation of grace is working perfectly. Because his idea is to keep you from having functional life. So he wants you to utilize the law. He wants the law of your mind to be in place. And he wants you to entertain the notion that you can use the law. And Paul is doing it every way he can to show you that will not work, that cannot work, that has never worked, that never will work. So that is the law of sin in our members. All right, now, I only got a couple of minutes left here, And what I need to do is I think everybody understands that part. Does anybody have a question about the laws there? Do you get it? You really do? Okay, I'm going to make this statement, and then we're moving to verse 24. I told you some things earlier back in Romans chapter 6 about your identity in Christ. And I said, if you don't understand this, you're going to get to a place you're going to have a hole in your understanding and you're just going to be scratching your head. You're going to get that in the next session. That's coming up. I'm going to tell you about this now. If you don't understand this, it's going to come back and haunt you. So if you have a question about it, say it now. It's okay. All right, verse 24. I gave you those laws, and the law sent in my members. 23, I did that one, captivity. Verse 24. O wretched man that I am, who shall deliver me from the body of this death? When you read that with the exclamation point on it, O wretched man that I am, don't you get the idea that that's almost a cry of frustration over trying to utilize the law to produce a life that is pleasing to God? He says, the more I try, the more sin overpowers me. This thing is like a law. It works this way every time. Oh, wretched man. The wretched man, I'm going to make this very clear. The wretched man is any Christian trying to live for God under the law of Moses. That's the wretched man. And that's what Paul is saying by his own testimony. When he says at the end part of this verse, who shall deliver me from the body of this death? Deliverance, just as it did in justification, deliverance from this can only come from God by grace, just like your justification did. That's why he provided a perfect sanctification for you. Verse 26, by the way, who shall deliver me? Notice what it did not say. It did not say what shall deliver me. The what you would think would be the law. It's a who. That tells you something very important right there. Verse 25, here's the answer to the question. Who shall deliver me from the body of this death? I thank God through Jesus Christ our Lord. You knew the answer to that already, that thing was going to be done. Now I want to show you the end of this in there's two phrases here at the end. He says, I thank God through Jesus Christ our Lord. So then, with the mind, do you see that? With the mind, I myself serve the law of God. Remember when I told you that was important? Don't just think I'm dreaming up terminology, because he's fixing to tell you in chapter 8 all these things that now need to replace that in your mind, that allow you to no longer live under the law but live under grace. You're going to have grace thinking installed in you starting in the next session. In chapter 8 verse 1. But he's making sure that he's sweeping the room clean here. And he says, so then with the mind, I myself serve the law of God. But with the flesh, the law of sin. Do you see that? And what he's doing is he's trying to clear everything out here so he can say, what we've got to do now is come along and do the one thing I haven't told you what to do. He did say, did he not? You are not under the law, but under grace. Didn't he? But you know the one thing he hasn't told you is, how does that work? How do I live under grace? The only thing you've told me is how not to do it. But you had to have that first. If you didn't, when you get into chapter 8, verse 1, all of a sudden you'll be going, yeah, but, or, well, what about? So he does all the well buts and what abouts and does away with all of it. And really, by this point right here, by verse 25, you ought to be firm in your mind and confident that there is no way you will ever utilize the law to successfully live unto God. That's the bottom line. If you do, you become the wretched man that Paul talked about in verse 24. So now that he has told you what it's not, when we come back in the next session, thank God for Romans chapter 8. We're going to begin to discover what